The acrid stench of my burned house was still in my hair when she strutted into my courtroom like she owned the place. There I sat, Judge Miriam Blackwood, black robes on my shoulders, gavel in hand, staring at the woman who had just committed arson against a sitting judge. The sheer audacity of it made my teeth clench. But Bryn Ashworth Sterling had no idea what she had just walked into. Because when you torch a judge's home, you'd better pray she doesn't get the chance to return the favor legally. And honey, I was about to serve up a 5-course meal of justice with a side of federal prison time. This HOA Karen thought burning down my house would silence me. Instead, it lit a fire under me that would consume her entire criminal empire. Every illegal fine, every fraudulent claim, every intimidation tactic. I had it all documented, stacked neatly like dynamite waiting for a match. What would you do if your destroyer walked straight into your courtroom and practically handed themselves to you on a silver platter? Where are you watching from? Because trust me, this revenge gets brutal. But to understand how it all came to this, you need to step back 6 months before my house became a crime scene. Back when I was Judge Miriam Blackwood, respected, feared by criminals, and completely shattered as a woman. I had just buried Harold after cancer consumed him piece by piece. 28 years of marriage gone. Just like that. The 1940s craftsman home we'd built our lives in suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum. Pinewood Estates wasn't always this battlefield of McMansions and status games. It used to be a neighborhood of blue-collar families, retired teachers, and flower gardens that smelled of summer. But then the money moved in, and with it came gentrification's iron fist. Modest homes were torn down and replaced by sprawling 3-car garage monsters. The old-timers, people like Walt Henderson who had lived here since 1965, saw their property taxes skyrocket while new arrivals demanded standards that had nothing to do with community and everything to do with power. And at the center of this self-declared suburban revolution was Bryn Ashworth Sterling, the queen bee of Pinewood's gentrification army. Picture every entitled suburban nightmare you've ever seen, then multiply it by 10. Bryn was 45, the type who wore designer athleisure as if she were preparing for a magazine shoot just to grab groceries. She drove a silver Tesla worth more than most people's yearly salaries, carried overpriced superfood smoothies everywhere, and wielded her HOA presidency like a royal scepter. From the moment she moved in with her contractor husband, she announced she would elevate Pinewood to its full potential. Translation: get rid of anyone she didn't like. My first encounter with her came while I was building something sacred. During Harold's last months, we had planned a 6-foot privacy fence. It was supposed to be our sanctuary where we could drink coffee and watch the sunrise without prying eyes. After his funeral, I finished the project alone, each post a reminder of his hands, his voice, his love. The roses he had tended for 15 years still bloomed, their scent softening the grief that clung to me. That's when I heard the crunch of expensive boots on autumn leaves. And there she was. Bryn didn't greet me with condolences, or kindness, or even civility. Her words were a cold assessment. You must be the widow. I corrected her. Judge Blackwood. The title rolled off her tongue like it was a disease. She didn't care. Out came her pink tape measure, snapping through the air like a weapon. She measured my fence with theatrical precision before declaring it 2 inches too tall. She waived a regulation that didn't exist and claimed I owed $500 in violations plus removal costs. I stood in silence, my grief a shield, and waited as she rifled through her papers, only to come up empty. Because I had built that fence exactly 6 feet tall. Legally, properly, precisely. Her face flushed under her spray tan when she realized she had nothing. But instead of admitting defeat, she hissed out her threat. We'll see about that, Judge. That evening, over Harold's favorite bourbon, I pulled up court records. And there it was. 3 years earlier, Sterling Premium Builders had stood before my bench, trying to scam an 80-year-old veteran with false roof repair claims. I'd ruled against them decisively, even flagging them for contractor fraud investigation. So this fence wasn't about neighborhood standards. It was about revenge. But Bryn had made a critical mistake. She had picked a fight with a woman who had sentenced murderers, rapists, and con artists for 2 decades without blinking. A widow with nothing left to lose, and the full knowledge of how to weaponize the law. She wanted war? Then she had just declared it on the wrong person. The wood of Harold's fence felt rough under my palms that night. Not just a barrier, but a promise. To protect what was sacred. To defend his memory. To honor him the only way I knew how, by standing firm against those who tried to destroy it. And Bryn Ashworth Sterling had just become Exhibit A in a federal case she couldn't even imagine. 2 weeks later, the certified letters started pouring in. One after another, thick manila envelopes carrying fabricated violations. Each one more absurd than the last. My memorial stone for Harold? An unapproved decorative feature. My black mailbox, unchanged since the Reagan years? Non-regulation color. My single bird feeder that brought Cardinals, Harold's favorite, to the yard? Excessive feeding creating nuisance conditions. Every letter demanded fines, hundreds of dollars, backed by threats of liens and legal action. But what Bryn didn't realize was that I knew the law better than she ever could. These notices weren't worth the expensive stationery they were printed on. They were filled with holes, lacking due process, citing non-existent bylaws. And so, as the pink envelopes stacked on my desk, I began quietly preparing my counterattack. Not with anger, with precision, with patience, with the cold calculation of someone who had spent her life dismantling lies in courtrooms. But Bryn wasn't finished. Her next move was bolder, more reckless, and it would cross a line she could never uncross. Because soon, her petty harassment would transform into something far darker. An act that nearly cost me the only living connection I had left to Harold. And that was the moment she stopped being a nuisance and became a criminal. Wasn't satisfied with paper harassment. She had escalated her petty warfare from ink and envelopes into something far more dangerous. I'd seen it happen in my courtroom before. Small-time schemers who got away with their tricks too long eventually convinced themselves they were untouchable. They grew bolder, sloppier, and that arrogance always opened the door for their downfall. For Bryn, the door cracked open on a Thursday morning when I wasn't even home. I'd installed a full set of security cameras around my property after her barrage of fraudulent violation notices. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. I'd spent too many years watching people escalate from words into violence when intimidation didn't work. And sure enough, 1 week into her campaign, Bryn decided to take her crusade against me from the mailbox to my backyard. The footage was as clear as day. There she was in designer yoga pants and oversized sunglasses, strutting into my yard like she owned the deed. She waved her pink tape measure like a royal scepter, pulling it across my fence, my garden, my rose beds. She leaned into my kitchen window, shading her eyes with one manicured hand, peering inside at Harold's untouched coffee mug still sitting on the counter. The one I couldn't bring myself to wash. She wasn't just measuring anymore. She was trespassing, violating, testing the limits of how far she could push me. But her greatest cruelty came when she left. She didn't just walk out of my yard. She yanked my back gate wide open, deliberately, making sure the latch wouldn't catch. And then she walked away with a smirk carved across her face. When I came home that night, weary from sentencing yet another domestic abuser to 18 months in county, I didn't notice it at first. I didn't see the open gate. I didn't sense the danger. I only realized something was wrong when the house felt too still, too empty. My voice called out, soft at first, then panicked. Gavel. Nothing. Gavel wasn't just a cat. He was Harold's final gift to me. Rescued from the courthouse parking lot during a thunderstorm, the scrappy little tabby had sat on Harold's lap through every chemo session, purring through his pain. He had been there when I came home to an empty bed, curling beside me when I couldn't sleep. He was family, my last living connection to 28 years of marriage. And now he was gone. I searched for 3 days straight, my voice hoarse from calling his name through every alley, every storm drain, every corner of Pinewood Estates. Walt Henderson, pipe smoke clinging to his jacket, organized search parties. Even the Rodriguez family, who'd moved away after Bryn's relentless fines, came back to help. It was the phone call from Dr. Martinez at Mountain View Animal Emergency that ended the nightmare. His voice was cautious, heavy with bad news. They had my cat, But he wasn't okay. I rushed to the clinic and found Gavel barely conscious in an oxygen tent. His ribs broken, his body dehydrated, his spirit shattered. The vet's words struck like a hammer. These injuries are consistent with being chased by machinery, high-powered leaf blowers, maybe lawn equipment. The security footage confirmed it. 1 hour after Bryn's trespass, her landscaping crew had arrived. With industrial blowers in hand, they terrorized my cat, chasing him through the open gate she had deliberately left unsecured. Gavel bolted, terrified, until he fell into a storm drain 2 blocks away. That was where they left him. Broken, dying. This wasn't petty anymore. This wasn't about fines or fences. This was cruelty. This was attempted murder of my family. And Bryn had just committed multiple felonies against a sitting judge. I changed every lock on my property. I posted no trespassing signs. I filed criminal charges for unlawful entry and animal cruelty. Then I called Sarah Morgan at Channel 7, an investigative journalist with a reputation for tearing suburban corruption to shreds. Within 3 days, Judge versus HOA, when Watchdog's attack aired live across Colorado, Sarah exposed Bryn's pattern of targeting minorities, single parents, and elderly residents. She played the footage of Bryn's trespassing, her gate stunt, and the landscaping crew chasing Gavel. The community response was nuclear. Neighbors who'd been silent for years came forward with their own horror stories. Donations poured in, not just to cover Gavel's $800 surgery bill, but to fund the legal battle to dismantle Bryn's HOA empire. Justice for Gavel exploded across social media, turning my cat into a furry symbol of resistance against tyranny. Law firms offered pro bono services. The Colorado Attorney General's office opened an investigation into civil rights violations. And most importantly, Bryn's carefully curated suburban queen image shattered under the glare of public outrage. But for me, this wasn't about public perception. This was about war. Because Bryn had escalated from harassment to felonies, and I was ready to respond with every ounce of legal firepower at my disposal. The law was a scalpel in my hands, and I was about to cut out her entire empire piece by piece. As Gavel lay purring weakly against my chest for the first time since the attack, I drafted the complaints that would become her undoing. Animal cruelty, unlawful entry, fraud, conspiracy, each one sharpened to a razor edge, each one another nail in her coffin. Bryn thought she could terrorize me into silence. What she didn't realize was that she had awakened the side of me criminals feared most. The side that wasn't bound by compassion, only by the pursuit of justice. And as I built my case, as neighbors lined up with their own evidence, one thing became painfully clear. Bryn Sterling wasn't just a Karen with a God complex. She was running something bigger, something darker, something that went far beyond HOA harassment. And soon, I was about to discover the real empire she'd been hiding in plain sight. When intimidation fails, tyrants turn to character assassination. Bryn Sterling was no different. The certified letter landed on my desk on a Tuesday morning, its official seal glaring like a loaded weapon. Colorado Judicial Discipline Commission. For a moment, my hands hesitated before tearing it open, my gut already whispering what I'd find inside. Allegations. Serious ones. The words read like satire. Judge Blackwood abuses judicial authority to intimidate law-abiding homeowners. She weaponizes the legal system for personal vendettas, threatening community safety. The so-called evidence was a masterclass in fabrication. Doctored photographs showing Harold's memorial garden twisted into something resembling an overgrown junkyard. Falsified witness statements from her personal trainer and interior designer, claiming I had threatened them with retaliation. Timelines that would collapse under the faintest scrutiny, yet looked damning to anyone reading in bad faith. Bryn hadn't just filed the complaint. She had leaked it. Within hours, political blogs hostile to my environmental rulings were amplifying it. Soon my name trended on social media, accompanied by hashtags branding me as a rogue judge. Comment sections filled with demands for my impeachment, disbarment, and creative suggestions for what should happen to activist judges who hate America. For 72 hours, I sat inside a whirlwind of vitriol, watching 20 years of judicial service twisted into a caricature. But here's the thing about storms. Sometimes they blow something useful straight onto your doorstep. Her name was Patricia Donnelly, though she insisted everyone just call her Pat. She showed up at my door with a tin of oatmeal cookies and the kind of calm smile only someone truly dangerous can pull off. At first glance, she looked like every retired librarian in America. Sensible cardigan, orthopedic shoes, hands trembling slightly with age. What she didn't look like was a 25-year FBI veteran who had specialized in financial crimes. But that's exactly what she was. Pat spread photographs across my kitchen table with the precision of a card shark dealing a winning hand. Grainy surveillance stills, financial records, insurance documents, a timeline of names and identities. "Meet Bethany Sterling," Pat said, tapping one photograph. "Phoenix, Arizona. 3 insurance claims in 2 years. Convenient floods, electrical fires, vandalism. Total payouts, $400,000. All of it gone before the grand jury convened." She tapped another. "Same woman, different name, different city. Same scam." My judicial instincts snapped into focus. Bryn wasn't just a tyrant with a taste for intimidation. She was a professional fraud artist, a textbook operator. Move into an established neighborhood, stir chaos, manufacture violations to create the illusion of instability, file inflated insurance claims, drain HOA emergency funds, then vanish before the law catches up. Pat slid the last folder toward me. "She's not tormenting you out of personal vendetta. You're the distraction. While you're busy with complaints and violations, she's been quietly siphoning funds from the HOA and preparing her next big insurance payout." The folder was a prosecutor's dream. Bryn's current homeowner's insurance application, packed with lies, valuing her $800,000 home at $2.8 million. False claims history, altered financial background, federal mail fraud, insurance fraud, conspiracy, all wrapped in one pretty bow. But the part that made my blood run cold was this. She'd already filed preliminary paperwork for developing structural issues on her property. Translation: she was setting the stage for an accidental disaster. A fire, a flood, something catastrophic that would leave Pinewood Estates bankrupt while she walked away with millions. Suddenly, my fence, my memorial stone, my bird feeder, none of it mattered. They were props, distractions, noise designed to keep the neighborhood divided while she set up her real payday. It explained everything. The relentless targeting of minorities and elderly homeowners, the manufactured conflicts, the intimidation campaigns. She was driving out anyone likely to resist or question her tactics, consolidating control, and preparing the stage for her grand finale. Pat's eyes narrowed behind her glasses. She's done this before, more than once. But she's sloppy now, greedy, and you, Judge, might just be the worst possible person for her to tangle with. I looked at the photographs, at the forged identities and fraudulent claims. My grief-hardened heart burned with something new. Purpose. Harold had always said good legal strategy was like surgery. Precise, methodical, devastating. And this was open-heart surgery on a criminal empire. Bryn had tried to bury me under fabricated fines and slander. She had tried to break my spirit by attacking Harold's memory and nearly killing Gavel. But all she had done was hand me a trail of evidence thick enough to bury her 6 feet deep in federal prison time. I closed the folder, my hands steady for the first time in months. The smear campaign hadn't destroyed me. It had introduced me to my most valuable ally. Pat didn't come with condolences or pity. She came with ammunition, and with her help, I was about to turn Bryn's suburban kingdom into her personal gallows. Because when you commit fraud in the shadow of a federal judge, you don't just risk exposure. You guarantee annihilation. And Bryn Sterling had no idea the hammer was already falling. The moment I closed Pat Donnelly's folder, something inside me shifted. For months, I had been playing defense, enduring violation notices, hearings, slander, and humiliation. But now I had clarity. Bryn Sterling wasn't some eccentric tyrant obsessed with lawn gnomes and fences. She was a career fraudster, using intimidation as camouflage for her real operation. And I finally had the scalpel sharp enough to cut her open. I knew better than anyone that the truth doesn't win on its own. It has to be sharpened, framed, and delivered in the right court. So my first move was simple strategy. Pat and I spent late nights at my kitchen table, combing through every page of HOA financial reports. The patterns were clear to her trained eye. Large maintenance expenditures paid to companies that didn't exist. Landscaping bills inflated by hundreds of %. An insurance claim pending on a foundation crack that didn't exist until Bryn herself filed a report no other neighbor could verify. The HOA's reserve fund had drained by nearly half in less than 18 months, and every road led back to Bryn. But evidence wasn't enough. I needed to dismantle her armor, her iron grip on the community. And that required one thing she despised most, sunlight. So I went public. The neighborhood newsletter, usually filled with recipes and dog walking tips, featured a special edition written under my name. Where's our money going? It was calm, clinical, and utterly devastating. I laid out numbers, charts, a simple side-by-side of what neighbors paid in dues versus what was actually spent. No accusations, just questions. The reaction was immediate. Homeowners who had silently endured her reign suddenly found their voices. People who had been fined into bankruptcy recognized the pattern. The HOA emergency meeting that followed was the first in years where Bryn wasn't in full control. She barked and threatened, but the room was different now. The spell was broken. For the first time, Bryn looked rattled. And that was when I began phase 2. Quietly, I reached out to the Colorado Division of Insurance and the U.S. Postal Inspector's Office. I packaged Pat's evidence like a case brief, layered and airtight. Fraud across state lines meant federal jurisdiction. Mail fraud alone carried a 20-year sentence. With insurance fraud stacked on top, Bryn wasn't facing fines or reprimands. She was staring at decades behind bars. But before the hammer could fall, Bryn doubled down. The night before the inspectors were scheduled to review the HOA's books, Pinewood Estates erupted in chaos. A burst water pipe, flooding the community center. Bryn arrived dramatically in rubber boots, clipboard in hand, declaring it proof that their infrastructure was failing, and that her emergency insurance claim was justified. Except it wasn't an accident. Pat and I had already documented Bryn's late-night visits to the maintenance shed, caught by a neighbor's security camera. The broken valve, we later confirmed, had been tampered with deliberately. Her insurance scam was unfolding in real time, and she was reckless enough to think no one was watching. The community center stank of sewage, neighbors huddled in disbelief, and Bryn, smiling too wide, looked around like a stage actress basking in applause. But she didn't see me standing in the corner, camera in hand, recording everything. By dawn, that footage was in 3 places: the insurance investigator's inbox, the postal inspector's files, and, most damning of all, on the phones of dozens of residents who had finally realized who Bryn really was. The HOA president's iron mask cracked in front of her subjects. The woman who had tormented me over bird feeders and fence rails was suddenly exposed as something much darker. And when tyrants sense their empire slipping, they don't retreat. They lash out. The next move Bryn made was her most dangerous yet. Because if intimidation and fraud couldn't silence me, she was ready to cross the final line. One that could have ended far more than just reputations. There is something feral about a predator when it realizes the prey is no longer running. That was Bryn Sterling now. A woman who had built her entire kingdom on intimidation, only to find her subjects whispering behind her back, watching her every move. The newsletter, the charts, the footage of her sabotage, it had stripped away her invincibility. The calls from insurance investigators were no longer friendly check-ins, but interrogations. Postal inspectors circled, and neighbors, once cowed into silence, now lingered outside her house in little clusters, exchanging rumors. For the first time, Bryn wasn't the voice of authority in Pinewood Estates. She was the subject of gossip, and she hated it. Her retaliation began subtly. My mailbox was stuffed daily with anonymous, venomous letters. My trash cans overturned, my car keyed. Each act petty, but pulsing with rage. Neighbors shrugged, but I knew whose fingerprints, if not literal, then spiritual, were on every incident. Then came the late-night prowling. I would glance out my bedroom window and catch the faint silhouette of a figure watching my house from the tree line. Sometimes it was gone in seconds. Sometimes it lingered just long enough for me to know I wasn't imagining it. One morning, I woke to find my backyard gate wide open, the latch broken. My dog, Bailey, had gotten out. Hours later, I found him trembling near the creek, unharmed but shaken. That was no accident, it was a message. Still, I didn't break, and that drove Bryn deeper into madness. The HOA called a special emergency session at her request. She filled the community center with dramatic displays of evidence, photoshopped receipts, doctored invoices, and hastily scribbled maintenance reports. She raged about my campaign of lies, pointing directly at me as if I were the criminal. But this time, no one clapped. No one shouted in agreement. They just stared at her, eyes narrowed, lips pressed. Doubt had become a permanent resident in Pinewood Estates. And when doubt takes root, power crumbles. That night, the mask fully slipped. I returned from grocery shopping to find my front door ajar. My stomach dropped. The house was quiet, too quiet. I moved cautiously, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. The neat pile of my HOA violation notices stacked on the kitchen counter, topped with a single photograph. A photo of me, taken through my living room window. The message couldn't have been clearer. I see you. I can reach you anywhere. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the door showed no signs of forced entry. They wrote a report, shook their heads sympathetically, and drove away. To them, it was neighborly drama, not a crime. But to me, it was war. Pat urged me to hold steady. The investigators were close to moving. Bryn was spiraling, reckless. Every step she took now tightened the rope around her own neck. And then came the night it all broke. An HOA finance audit had been scheduled for the following week. One Bryn couldn't cancel. Everyone knew the outcome would be devastating for her. On the eve of that audit, the fire started. Smoke billowed from the community storage shed, the very place holding decades of HOA records. Neighbors rushed with hoses, but the flames consumed everything inside. Bryn arrived late, hair in curlers, clutching a bathrobe, performing outrage for anyone watching. But she had miscalculated. Because while she thought she had erased the paper trail, she didn't know Pat and I had already digitized every file, every ledger, every receipt. The evidence was safe. And now we had something new, arson. Bryn Sterling had gone from neighborhood tyrant to criminal arsonist in one desperate act. The morning after, investigators from the postal inspector's office arrived with warrants. FBI agents followed, their jackets unmistakable against the suburban lawns. Neighbors peeked through blinds as Bryn, red-faced and shrieking, was led away in handcuffs. But her arrest wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of her reckoning. Because when her empire collapsed, it didn't just crush her. It revealed the entire rot she had built on. And I would be there, front row, to watch the gavel come down. A weight unlike any other place. The air hums with tension, every cough, every shuffle magnified. For Bryn Sterling, it was the stage she had spent years avoiding, and now she was forced into the spotlight with no script, no control. The trial of the state versus Bryn Sterling drew more attention than anyone in Pinewood Estates could have imagined. Local news vans parked at the courthouse steps, reporters eager to tell the story of the suburban HOA president who had turned her neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. Neighbors filled the benches, some out of loyalty, most out of morbid curiosity. Bryn entered, no longer in her tailored suits and pearl necklaces. Instead, she wore the dull gray of county detention, her once perfect hair flat and lifeless. She scanned the crowd, her eyes briefly finding mine. For the first time since I'd known her, there was no fire in them, only a flicker of panic. The prosecution laid out the case with brutal precision. They revealed the financial misconduct, years of skimming HOA dues, falsifying invoices, and funneling money into personal accounts. The jury winced as receipts for luxury vacations, jewelry, and high-end spa retreats were projected on the courtroom screen, each one paid for by community maintenance fees. Then came the sabotage. Testimony from neighbors, surveillance clips of her late-night prowling, and the chilling photograph she had left on my counter. The courtroom murmured at the blatant malice. Finally, the crescendo, the fire. Investigators testified about accelerants found in the ashes of the storage shed. A neighbor swore under oath that they had seen Bryn's car leaving the scene just minutes before the flames erupted. The arson charge transformed her from neighborhood bully to public danger. Her defense tried to spin it all as a witch hunt, neighbors conspiring to bring down a strong leader. They painted me as a vindictive troublemaker. But with every claim, the prosecution countered with facts, documents, evidence too heavy to be denied. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Bryn's once commanding voice shrank each day, her outbursts silenced by the judge, her bravado stripped. By the time closing arguments came, she looked less like the queen of Pinewood Estates and more like what she truly was, a woman who had overreached and lost everything. When the jury returned, the room held its breath. Guilty, on every count: embezzlement, mail fraud, harassment, arson. Bryn Sterling was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The gasp that followed was less shock, more release. The collective exhale of a neighborhood freed from her chokehold. I walked out of that courtroom into the afternoon sun, feeling lighter than I had in years. Neighbors who had once avoided me now approached with nods, handshakes, even apologies. The walls of silence and fear had finally crumbled. Pinewood Estates was no utopia, but it was ours again. Committees were rebuilt, this time with transparency. The newsletter became a symbol not of propaganda, but of accountability. For the first time, decisions were made together, not dictated from a throne. As for Bryn, she remained a ghost of whispers, her name a cautionary tale told at backyard barbecues. The woman who once controlled everything had lost it all. And me? I found peace not in her downfall, but in knowing I never gave in to her tyranny. I stood my ground, and in the end, truth held. Because sometimes, the greatest victory isn't in revenge. It's in survival and watching the empire of a tyrant collapse under its own weight.